There are evenings a man carries home in his chest for the rest of his life, and that is the only way I know to begin. I am not a musical person. 39 years as a county solicitor left me with an eye for a contract and an ear for the pause before a man tells you something he'd rather not. I know very little about the piano. I know a good deal about rooms, the way they fill and empty, the way a person can stand in one for an entire evening without once being seen. I tell you this because I want you to understand that what I am about to describe is not the account of a man who was looking for something beautiful that night. I was there to sit on the dais for the Civic Centenary Committee, eat a reasonably poor chicken supreme, and shake hands with the mayor. I was not prepared for Nora Maddox. The Hartfield Crown Hotel has a private dining room on the first floor, red damask walls, a long table for 60, and a battered upright piano in the near corner that I do not believe anyone had touched in the 22 years I had attended events there. It stood the way a forgotten umbrella stands, present, patient, unexamined. The village civic centenary dinner was a formal affair, black tie, the mayor's chain, the usual speeches about heritage and continuity and the enduring character of the parish. 60 guests, most of them known to me. And Nora Maddox, who had worked at the Hartfield Lending Library for 22 years and was known to almost all of them. She was in her late 60s, Nora, a small, composed woman with gray hair pinned simply and a dark blue dress that was correct in every way without being remarkable. She had checked out books to most of the people in that room. She had recommended novels, tracked down obscure parish histories, renewed memberships without being asked when she noticed someone had let theirs lapse. She had spoken to them all, quietly and warmly, for 2 decades. And I can say with some confidence that not one person in that dining room, including myself, had ever given Nora Maddox a second thought. That is not a cruel observation. It is simply the truth, and I have found that the truth, when properly examined, can be the most startling thing in a room. Roland Ashby arrived that evening as our guest of honor. You may know the name. He was a television and radio man, a cultural commentator of some national standing, the sort of person who considers himself a great appreciator of talent and who has, in my experience, very little of it himself. He was loud in the way that men are loud when they have decided the room belongs to them, and he moved through the centenary dinner as though he were conferring a distinction simply by being present. I watched him with the professional detachment of a man who has spent a career reading people in rooms, and I thought, he will say something before the evening is out that he will later wish he hadn't. I was correct. It was after the pudding plates had been cleared and before the port. Ashby was on his feet again, making the rounds, holding court. And he happened to pause near the far corner, near the piano, at the exact moment that Nora Maddox was standing beside it, not touching it, not looking at it with any particular intention, simply standing in the quiet way she always stood. She had, I think, been making her way toward the door to the corridor and had paused to let a waiter pass. Ashby saw her. His voice carried, these things always carry. Mrs. Maddox, he said, warmly, as though he were doing her an honor. Since you are a librarian, perhaps you can find us a tune, something simple, something the room can clap along to. He gestured toward the piano with a glass of Burgundy, easy and expansive. Something cheerful. A carol, or whatever you like. Several people laughed. Not unkindly, it was the laughter of a room that assumes a mildly comical moment and is happy to enjoy it. I laughed too, I am sorry to say. I had a champagne glass in my hand and an absolutely unconsidered certainty that what was about to happen was nothing, that Nora would smile, demur politely, and move on. That was what you expected from Nora Maddox. That was what the room expected. That was, I realize now, the whole of our collective imagination where she was concerned. She did not demur. She looked at Ashby for a moment, not defiantly, not with any heat at all, and then she looked at the piano. She set down her glass of water on a nearby table. And she sat down at the stool. The room did not fall silent immediately. There was still the murmur of a dozen conversations, the clink of coffee cups, someone asking a waiter about the port. Nora adjusted the stool, just a quiet half-turn of the knob on the right-hand side, and she sat very still for a moment with her hands in her lap. I was watching her because I had nothing else to watch. And I noticed, in that moment, that she had closed her eyes. Then she placed her hands on the keys, and the room changed. It was Satie, I know that now, though I did not know it then. I have since looked it up. The piece is called Gymnopédie No. 1, and it begins with a sound that is almost no sound at all, a wide, open chord in the left hand, repeated, as patient as water. I have read that Satie composed it to be played slowly and painfully, and that is precisely how Nora played it, though what I felt was not pain but something I have no better word for than weight. The weight of a thing that has been kept for a very long time. The conversations did not stop all at once, they subsided by degrees, the way light fades on a winter afternoon, and within 30 seconds there was not a voice in the room. There were 60 people in that dining room and not one of them was speaking. I should say, the piano was not a good instrument. It was an old hotel upright, probably tuned twice in a decade, several of its keys carrying the slight yellowish cast of age. It did not matter. Under Nora's hands it sounded as though it had been waiting, for precisely as long as she had, to say exactly this. The right hand carried the melody, simple, stepping, heartbreakingly steady, and I am a man who has never wept at music in his life, and I felt something shift behind my sternum that I was not willing to examine too closely. She came to the end of the gymnopédie, and I thought she would stop. The room was ready to breathe. And then she did not stop, she moved without any pause, without any seam at all, from that piece into something else entirely. A different thing. Something that did not have the measured, architectural feel of the Satie, something that felt more tentative, more searching, as though it had been found rather than written. A melody that circled, returned to itself, paused, and then returned again, slightly different each time, as though it were looking for the right words and could not quite find them. It took me perhaps a minute to understand that I was hearing something I had not been meant to hear. Not in the sense that it was private, she was playing it for 60 people, but in the sense that it was not a performance. It was a letter. She was sitting at a battered hotel upright in her dark blue dress, in a room full of people who had asked her for something simple to clap along to, and she was writing a letter in the only language she had available. I cannot tell you how long she played. I have since asked others who were there, and the answers range from 4 minutes to 12, which suggests that none of us were counting properly. The melody developed, it grew quieter before it grew fuller, which is not the way these things usually go, and the fuller it became, the more it felt like an answer to a question I had not known was being asked. At a certain point I became aware that the woman beside me, Patricia Henning, 63, a retired district nurse who I have known for 30 years and who I have never seen show any particular emotion at a social occasion, was pressing a handkerchief to the corner of her eye with an expression of careful, concentrated effort. On my other side, the mayor had folded his hands on the table and was looking at them. The last few minutes were the quietest. The melody came back to something close to the opening, that circling, patient return, and then it stopped. Not abruptly, it simply found its end, the way a very long sentence finds its period. Nora's hands rested on the keys for a moment. Then she lifted them and placed them in her lap. The room did not immediately respond. There was perhaps 4 seconds of absolute silence, the kind that I have only otherwise encountered in a courtroom at the moment before a verdict. And then Patricia Henning began to cry, not quietly, but with the sudden candor of someone who has abandoned the effort of composure, and the woman across the table from her followed, and then a man I did not recognize stood up, and then it was as though the whole room had decided at once, and 60 people were on their feet. I watched Roland Ashby from across the table. He had set his burgundy down at some point during the performance, I had not noticed the moment, and he was sitting with both hands flat on the damask cloth. He did not stand when the others stood. He sat for a moment longer, and his face had the expression of a man who has just been informed of something he wishes he had known much earlier. Then, slowly, he stood. He did not applaud noisily, the way he had laughed and held court. He put his hands together and he stood there with the rest of the room, and he said nothing at all. Nora remained at the piano for a moment. Then she stood, straightened her dress, and walked back toward the edge of the room. The room continued, people were embracing, wiping their faces, turning to one another in that urgent way of people who have shared something and need to confirm to themselves that it was real. I made my way to the corner, I am not entirely sure why. Perhaps the solicitor in me simply needed to know. She was standing near the window. I asked her, because I could not think of anything else to ask, where she had learned to play. My father taught me, she said. I used to play in the evenings. A pause. I haven't played for anyone in rather a long time. I asked about the second piece. The one that had not been the Satie. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, in the precise, unhurried way that she spoke to you from behind the lending desk when you asked about a book she thought you truly needed to read, For 7 years, every Friday morning, a bunch of white freesias appeared on my doorstep. No card. No note. I never knew who. She paused. Gerald Crane died in March. His daughter was clearing his papers and she found a standing order at Baxter's, the florist on the high street. She came and told me. Gerald Crane had been a retired schoolteacher. He had lived alone in the gray stone house on Millgate Lane for as long as I could remember. I had drawn up his will, many years ago. A quiet man, precise and courteous, who returned his library books on the exact day they were due. I wrote it for him, Nora said. Over the years. I didn't know it was for him at the time. I just wrote it. She looked at the piano. It was the only answer I had. I did not know what to say. I am a man trained in the management of words in difficult moments, and I had nothing. I nodded, which seemed insufficient, but it was all I had. She thanked me for asking. She picked up her glass of water from the table. And then she was gone, back into the room, and someone was shaking her hand, and someone else was touching her arm, and Roland Ashby was making his way toward her through the crowd with the cautious, purposeful movement of a man who has decided he owes someone an apology and is trying to determine whether it will be accepted. I have thought about that evening a great many times since. I have thought about Gerald Crane cycling to Baxter's, presumably on a Thursday, for 7 years, leaving a standing order for white freesias with no card. I have thought about Nora Maddox opening her door every Friday morning to find them, knowing nothing, and then sitting down at an upright piano in a back room somewhere, her kitchen, perhaps, or a small study, and playing, and writing, and keeping. I have thought about the tremendous patience of a devotion that expects nothing in return and gives everything it has to the giving, and I have thought about what it costs a person to carry something beautiful and private for 7 years with no one to receive it. He never told her. She never knew. And the only thing she had, in the end, was the music she had written without knowing who it was for, and a room full of people who had asked her for something simple, and received instead the whole of it. I am 71 years old. I have sat in rooms where extraordinary things were decided and ordinary things were said, and I have developed, over the decades, a reasonably accurate sense of the weight of a moment. That night in the private dining room of the Hartfield Crown Hotel, a woman in a dark blue dress sat at an old upright piano that nobody had touched in years, and played 7 years of unanswered letters to a man who was no longer alive to hear them. I believe he heard them anyway. I don't know why I believe this. I simply do.